Plates have been on my mind a lot recently, both as functional objects and as backdrops for arrangements of pots I want to make and display in the future. This video will cover the trimming of two different shapes, but first I have to clean up the bats, which, like you might have noticed, have warped significantly. This was entirely my fault, as I left the plates on these bats for way too long, and as a result they've bowed. But this is something I should be able to correct relatively easily, and I'll show you how I do that in a moment. After all the waste is scraped off the bats, I use this still slightly soft clay to pick up all the small remaining bits, as ideally I want to recycle as much of this as I can. And as this waste is either made up of very thin slithers or tiny specks of clay, I can simply chuck it straight into my reclaim bucket, and once submerged in water, it'll dissolve in moments. You can see just how bowed this bat is, which would make it practically useless for throwing on. I left the thrown plates to dry on these bats over the weekend, which really wasn't the best idea. To fix this, I'm scrubbing down and saturating all the bats, and I'm constantly rinsing the sponge in the bowl of water to my right, which means that none of the clay is actually going down the sink. I need the bats to be really quite wet for this to work, and once they've all been scrubbed and soaked, I place the ones with only a subtle distortion upright, like this, and as they slowly dry and the water seeps to the bottom of them, they should become mostly flat. As for the really bowed one, I soak it a touch more and then place something very heavy on it. These two techniques work well with these MDF bats, but you might need to experiment with yours until you find a solution that makes them flat again. I'll be trimming two very different shapes in today's video, starting with this one, with a very flat interior with walls that slope upward that I left purposefully very thick, so that they could be trimmed exactly to my liking. I'll be trimming the inside of this form quite extensively, so I begin by tap centering the plate so it spins directly in the middle of the wheel, and then secure it in place with 3 lumps of soft clay, which, as the plate itself is so sturdy and thick, I push the chunks of clay really firmly into it, as there's absolutely no risk of the thrown form being distorted. Trimming the interiors of pots is often something we're told not to do, especially to beginners. In theory, it does add another step to something you should have been able to refine properly at the throwing stage. It's understandable for some shapes, say for mugs and bowls, which I typically make in quantities of anywhere between 50 to 100. If I had to trim the insides of each of those, whilst constantly removing all the turnings that build up inside, then it would very quickly add a lot of time to the making process. But it's something I still do occasionally if I spot that a pot needs it. But with one-off pots, and typically with anything larger I make, I will usually do some trimming on the inside. I adore this process of refinement, and if I revel so much in turning the outside of the pot, well, then maybe I'll spend some time turning the inside too. For the internal base of this pot, I trimmed away about 1 millimeter or 2 and removed a chunk of porcelain, which you may have seen spinning around. After which, I'll spend some time burnishing and flattening this area using a smooth rubber kidney, just to get rid of the more prominent marks from the trimming process. Next, I'll begin work on the rim and the sloping section beneath it. I want this piece to have a flat top with sharp edges, so it interacts with the glaze nicely. I can then begin trimming the inside of the flange, although really there's no correct order in which to do all of this. Yet when trimming vases or taller forms, I tend to work from bottom to top. As I trim this pot, I need to make sure that the cross-section of the entire piece is roughly the same. If the base is much thicker than the rim, or vice versa, then there's a real chance a crack will form somewhere on the pot as it dries or when it's fired. The two thicknesses will dry out at different rates, and inevitably something can go wrong. And it's for this same reason that when it comes to drying flatware like this, it helps to do it very slowly and evenly, as if one side of the pot dries out more than the other, then it can lead to things like cracks forming or the entire pot distorting and not sitting flat. And there's nothing more annoying than a plate that rattles when it's set down, or one that spins as the high point on the base is in the middle of the plate. Now that the top has been trimmed, I can begin working on the underside. I'll be using bits of foam like this to support the base as I trim the bottom, as otherwise quite a wide expanse of clay could very well bend inward as I apply pressure on the base in order to trim it. It's important when making tableware that's relatively wide to never flip it in a way that might cause the piece to bend unnecessarily, which means from this point on, as the pot has become thinner, I'll only ever flip it between 2 bats, as that way I can ensure the piece stays flat. With the foam underneath the plate to support it, I can now tap center the piece, which I do by tap centering the bat rather than the plate itself. And for the time being, as the bowl is quite heavy and wide, I'll only secure the bat in place, as the dish will do a good job of holding itself down. When trimming the outer wall, my aim really is to mimic the shape on the inside, so that it follows the internal shape and I'm left with an even cross section. If you've been watching my videos for a while now, you'll know exactly what the tool in my left hand is. But for those who don't, it's what we call a spinner. Through it, I can apply considerable downward pressure without the clay rubbing and rotating on my fingertips. It also distributes the pressure I'm applying down with. This way, it isn't all focused in one spot, and it's especially useful for pots like this with a wide, thin base, as I can push down really hard and I don't have to worry about the base itself bowing inward and deforming. When I'm trimming pots I'm unfamiliar with, if at any point I'm unsure about just how much more clay there is left to remove, I'll simply take the pot off the wheel and feel the cross section of the walls. It's better taking a moment to do this, so you know more accurately how much more clay is left to remove, rather than trimming in the dark and not knowing when to stop. In this case I had another 2 or 3 millimeters to trim away, and whilst the pot did feel light, it felt a tiny bit unbalanced with the excess weight residing in the walls of the dish. Then I can move on to the base, which doesn't need a ton of work. Essentially, all I need to do is trim it flat and then turn a very shallow footwell to remove a bit of heft from the bottom. I push down lightly as I trim and tap it occasionally too, in order to ascertain information about how thick the base is. If I trim the base to be too thin and I glaze it too thickly, there's a real chance the base section of the pot could crack. So if anything, I'm not trimming the bottom to be exceedingly thin, as it simply needs to be able to withstand a thick layer of glaze and a very hot reduction firing. As the vessel gets lighter, there's a greater chance it'll get pulled off centre as I'm turning it, and I think I'll have to add some lugs of clay to keep it pinned down soon, to keep the plate from skidding all over the MDF bat. With the last of the excess weight trimmed out of the footwell, I'll scrape over this surface to make it flat, first with a sharp metal scraper, and then with a smoother rubber kidney, which really burnishes the stoneware. Before the plate is stamped, I'll flip the vessel over one last time between two bats, just so I can feel the cross section and check that I've turned enough away. The walls felt nice and even, so I put the foam back, flip the plate over, and stamped it with my maker's mark. With the dish finished, I'll place it upright once again, and I'll dry the plate out really slowly on a very flat surface beneath loosely slung plastic. I'll also make sure to rotate the piece every day about 90 degrees to make me feel a bit more confident about the piece drying evenly and not predominantly from one side. The next plate is altogether a different type of object. I want these to be simple expanses of glaze, like these smaller versions I've made previously. They'll be to place pots onto, but they'll also be to place behind other pieces, leaning up against the wall to create a circular backdrop to frame whichever pots are placed in front of it. These were thrown as very simple, solid discs of clay. I threw the top to have a very slight concave surface, which I'll trim to exaggerate further to create a hollow into which the glaze will pool really nicely. Vessels like this are exceedingly satisfying to work on, although flatware typically produces a vast amount of reclaim. I then scrape back over the more prominent turning marks, creating a smooth, continuous surface. The majority of the work on these is on the underside, especially close to the rim. I flip the plate upside down between bats, which again I do to prevent any unnecessary warping or bending of the dish. Once again I tap center the piece by tapping the wood rather than the pot, and as this is quite a thick, heavy, expansive clay, it'll hold itself down nicely. I'll be trimming the edge of this plate really aggressively, so in this case I'm placing another, smaller MDF bat beneath the spinner so that the downward pressure exerted is spread out over a greater area. Then the trimming can commence. Most of which shot straight onto the floor, into a neat little pile next to my foot. I want these plates to have an overhanging rim, so, when viewed from the side, they look as if they're floating, almost. Whereas for the thicker, expansive clay in the middle, I'll leave it mostly untouched, save for a quick trim just to neaten up the surface, and to remove the wiring off marks, which you can see spinning in a rough spiral across the base. With the plate now finished, I stamp it with my maker's mark, and then with it sandwiched between two bats, I flip it back around. I checked the curved surface, and I noticed in this case I could actually push down the centre somewhat, which I did before smoothing over the entire top with a plastic kidney. Hopefully I'll be glazing and firing these really soon, so keep an eye out for that next video, and as always thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.